Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the spectacular conflagration that was the revolutions of 1848. So we're going to do a little bit of background here and then dive into the effects of what happens when reform doesn't happen quickly enough or the various groups involved in the reform are not totally unified as far as what their goals and what their potential outcomes are going to be. So we're going to lay out the various groups, talk about the pressures building in Europe in the 1840s, then we're going to look at another French Revolution and talk about Metternich's fall and the cascading series of revolutions that spread across Europe in the aftermath of this momentous event. So let's dive in. We're going to start with de Tocqueville's The Volcano. So take a minute, pause, and read this. He more or less predicts the whole situation and lays out the various forces involved here. So take a minute, pause, answer questions, and then we'll dive into the actual events. As we talked about previously, Europe was very basically divided into three different political camps. On the one hand, you have the conservatives, represented by Clemens von Metternich of Austria, who wanted to resist change in general. They opposed constitutional government. For the most part, they wanted absolutism, or at the best, enlightened absolutism, where absolute rulers held all power but were giving people some civil rights. Then you've got the liberals who are trying to answer the political question, basically putting in constitutions, limits on government, increasing popular participation in government, civil rights, more middle class people moving in, more economic modernization, things like that. These are your middle class people who are looking to break into government and are frustrated when the nobles, the aristocracy, and the powers that be hold a monopoly on all government posts. And then you've got the radicals. The radicals come in a whole bunch of different areas. Some of them are pushing for things like universal suffrage. Some of them are pushing for redistribution of property. And in the aftermath of this, you're going to see socialists and communists of all various flavors and persuasions coming out of the woodwork, trying to reform society and fix some of the inherent inequality in capitalism. And so we're going to see all those movements, which are really going to shape the latter half of the 19th and especially the 20th century. So let's dive in and talk about all these various forces. At this point, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the forces of order are ascendant. Clemens von Metternich and his followers have created the Holy Alliance to attempt to rule by Christian principles, and have created the Concert of Europe, in which monarchs promised to help put down revolutions. And so we talked previously about the failed revolutions of the 1820s, when in the aftermath of the whole Napoleonic order collapsing, there were some attempts to push for reforms, and in general, European countries stomped on this almost immediately, reestablishing the status quo with the fear that any type of reform would lead to a sort of slippery slope, moving us into the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and potentially, 2 decades of warfare. So completely understandable and rational, but at the same time, what we're going to see is a bunch of people who are accustomed to reform not seeing those reforms happening, and most of the issues that Europe was facing at this point being swept under the rug and not being paid attention to. Here's Metternich's Political Confessions of Faith. We read this, of course, with the Congress of Vienna lesson, but for this semester, we'll have you read it again. Pause, take it in, answer questions. Let's move on. We also, at this point, get the forces of nationalism. The French Revolution really unleashed this idea of nationalism on the rest of Europe, demonstrating what a nation of people could be if they were united. So as opposed to France being the aristocrats and the king, France all of a sudden became a union of all the French people. The Levée en masse mobilized the entire French society, and France was able to more or less conquer all of Europe over the span of about 10 years by forming the people into this sort of national consciousness. And so if you think everyone else in Europe was not looking at that and saying, on the one hand, wow, that's scary. But on the other hand, how can we harness these forces to unite our own national populations and forge a great society for ourselves? And so in the aftermath of this, you're going to see movements to try to create an Italian nation, a German nation, some Slavic nations, a nation of Magyars in what is today Hungary, stuff like that. We're going to see these movements to create national homelands for these people so they can have a place and a nation state Well, a nation state is, of course, a country that has a single nation as a part of it, right, that represents them in order to try to push for their national interests. And so this is going to be a key force behind all of these movements as well. The whole thing starts with the July Revolution. As you hopefully remember in France, after the downfall of Napoleon, they decided to put Louis's brother, Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, on the throne. Well, he ruled for a couple years, but he was not a particularly vigorous king. The problem is, when he died and his brother, Charles X, took the throne, he's going to attempt to reestablish French absolutism. You can't totally reestablish French absolutism because, of course, there's constitutional reforms that have happened in France. The French are not going to allow you to roll back and really create the ancien regime, but he's going to start dissolving parliaments, which, as we remember back to the English Revolution, not good. He's going to pass a series of laws called the May Edicts, which are going to put strict censorship requirements on the press, are going to prevent freedom of the press from happening. And we're going to see something called the law of the double vote, where rich people get to vote multiple times based on their wealth, basically disenfranchising all of the poor and middle class people to ensure that conservatives are elected to the legislature, and anyone who wants reform is going to be stymied in this whole thing. Obviously, this is going to massively outrage the French population, and we're going to have a revolution against Charles X. In the streets of Paris, middle-class shopkeepers and the National Guard. Oh, the other thing he did, which is, of course, incredibly not smart, is he attempted to disband the National Guard, but let them keep their weapons. And so you've got the army that generally defends the French Revolution, now no longer formally an army, but they still have their weapons, they still have their commanders, and they're now pissed because they're not getting paid anymore. So, way to go, Charles. Way to alienate just about everyone who would have had an interest in upholding your regime. So, in the end, what we get is the barricades going up in the streets of Paris. People of Paris take to the streets, and in protest of this, they barricade the boulevards and the streets of Paris. And when the army goes in to try to clear out these barricades, all of a sudden barricades start going up behind them. The armies that Charles sent into Paris get trapped, then surrender, and now, with no military force left, Charles and his family are forced to flee the city and go into exile. And so, the king of France, the last Bourbon king, is now overthrown. Here we see an account of urban warfare from the book and play Les Miserables, which you should definitely watch/read, but we'll just take a moment to pause and answer the questions associated with it. And so the defeat of these forces lead to the rise of what's called the July Monarchy. Here's the famous Liberty Leading the People painting that represents this moment. And instead of the Bourbons, you're now going to get Louis Philippe, who's going to rise as sort of a middle-class king. We're going to bring back the French tricolor. We're going to get rid of censorship. We're going to give everyone the vote back, or at least the wealthy people the vote back. And he's going to help support the middle-class bourgeois French people. The bankers, the industrialists, all these people. The famous quote about Louis Philippe is, "Now the bankers can rule." And so we're going to get this sort of moderate, or liberal anyway, monarch who's somewhat limited, who's going to be ruling France. The problem is all those sans-culottes who rose up in the July Revolution hoping to reestablish, equality and fraternity and all that stuff, are going to be super disappointed with Louis Philippe. And so he is going to struggle to really appease all the different groups because, of course, the conservatives hate him because, he overthrew Charles X. The liberals, for the most part, are kind of in support of him. And then the sans-culottes, the poor people, hate him. And so 2 of the 3 groups are now against him, and that's going to be problematic. In 1830, we're also going to see a series of other revolutions. Belgium is going to rise up. We're going to see a revolution in northern Italy, which we'll talk about later. Greece is going to get its independence. We're going to see a revolution in Poland. There's going to be a revolution in Scotland attempting to restore the whole Stuart dynasty. But all of these revolutions are not going to amount to much. In the end, the powers that be decide that changing out Charles X, who everyone somewhat saw as incompetent, for Louis Philippe is okay, and the concert of Europe is not going to crush it immediately. They're like, France is somewhat stable, plus we have all these other problems. We don't necessarily want to deal with this. But Louis Philippe, as we said, was unable to appease a variety of different groups in society, and so what you started to get is protests against his rule. It was illegal under French law at this point to totally go out and protest and throw up barricades and things like that. But a series of banquets, which skirted around the laws about protest, started to crop up in order to basically use this as an excuse to criticize Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe then forced through a law banning these banquets. Then they started happening anyway. People got angry. There was huge protests associated with this. And we're going to overthrow Louis Philippe. Now they're going to establish a constitution. They're going to establish a republic. They're going to get rid of kings. They're going to get rid of kings altogether and embrace universal male suffrage, allowing everyone in France to vote. So, with Louis Philippe heading out the door in 1848, France is now going to become again a kingless republic with a constitution, a national assembly, a popularly elected executive. And everyone assumes that this is going to usher in a new age of somewhat socialism, social reforms, things like that. We'll give you a second. Here's the decrees of the French provisional government relating to the working man. So take a moment and read this, and hopefully you can see how this is attempting to appease the sans-culotte. So this is an attempt to bring in utopian socialism. Louis Blanc is most associated with this, trying to guarantee the right to work, amongst other rights. And so we're going to see a 10-hour workday. They're going to totally abolish slavery, and they're going to start creating these things called the national workshops in order to get people to guarantee that people are going to work. The problem is in the election, the socialists, the radicals, the left-leaning people lost the popular vote. In general, the French peasants went for a more moderate candidate, and Cavaignac decided that he didn't really like the national workshops, and so instead of creating a system of public works that would actually improve the quality of life for French people, instead what he did is create a bunch of way too few pointless jobs where more or less French workers who were unemployed were hired to dig holes and then fill them in again. It was pointless, it was boring, it was incredibly poorly paid, and the national workshops were mostly set up to fail. This critically and fatally undermined the platform of Louis Blanc and the socialists by intentionally sabotaging all of this. And when the next round of elections happened, the French people voted for Napoleon. Not, of course, the original Napoleon. He had, of course, died in St. Helena. And his son, of course, has also died. We instead have a cousin. His name is Louis Napoleon. But he's going to go by Napoleon III. He's going to run on a popular platform where he promises basically anything to everybody. And he's going to get elected in a landslide. And so now France is going to elect another Napoleon to take the title of what he called himself, Prince President Napoleon. So now we've got Prince President Napoleon as head of France. He is going to spend the next couple years weakening the power of the French Republic until he can eventually purge all radical officials. He's going to get reelected with almost 90% of the vote. He's going to start disbanding the National Assembly. And then eventually he's going to hold a plebiscite, a vote of the people, to declare himself the emperor of a new French empire. And so France went all the way from a restrictive, absolutist regime under Charles X to a restrictive, mostly absolutist regime under Napoleon III. So France is going to form another empire. Everyone in Europe is looking on in terror about this. And there's a real question as to what can be done about this. Should we invade? Should we overthrow this government? But before anything major can happen, so here's Napoleon III. He's going to take a moment and read, but he's going to try to convince everyone that he's not going to be like the other Napoleon. My favorite quote in here is, quote, "I say the empire is peace," which by that he means he's going to get involved in a bunch of wars. So take a moment, read, answer questions. Let's move on. The Second French Empire is going to get involved in a bunch of wars, famously, of course, getting involved in both the Crimean War, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in this unit, and his invasion of Mexico, which we talked about briefly in our Mexican independence lesson. So he's going to invade a couple other places, and he's going to build a series of very, very wide boulevards to prevent barricades from going up and him being overthrown. So this is going to allow him to, both really nice streets in Paris, the way Paris is sort of today, but also is going to allow him to move troops around Paris and prevent people from setting up the type of barricades that led to the overthrow of the last two regimes. All of this is compounded when the Prince of Order Metternich is overthrown by a student protest in Vienna. Radicals and liberals within the Austrian Empire had been watching all of this stuff unfold and were incredibly unhappy with the lack of reform in Austria and the perceived backwardness. And so we're going to see student protests get out of hand, and Clemens von Metternich is going to be forced to flee and is going to be removed as prime minister and fall from power. With Metternich falling, revolution is going to sweep across Europe. The clear message that is sent is the forces of order are now on the run. The concert of Europe is toothless. And if you want a constitution, if you want a national homeland, if you want radical distribution of property, now is the time to rise up and attempt to grab those things. Lajos Kossuth is going to rise up with a form of Magyar nationalism to try to create a state of Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So with Metternich gone, we're going to see a huge rebellion in half of the Austrian Empire. Here is the national song of Hungary. It's pretty straightforward as far as what they're calling for, but take a moment, answer questions. And in Germany, we're going to see huge rebellions. We're going to see the Kaiser thrown out of Berlin. Friedrich Wilhelm is going to be thrown out of Berlin by radicals. We're going to see attempts to establish a constitution in Frankfurt with the meeting of the Frankfurt Parliament. And there's this real push to have Prussia embrace sort of a liberal constitution and unite Germany as kind of a liberal constitutional monarchy, a la the United Kingdom or, maybe France under the July monarchy, because, that worked so well. Here we see the barricades going up and the forcing out of Friedrich Wilhelm. We're going to see a series of wars to push for German nationalism. And there's going to be a series of armies sort of marching around these German states, attempting to push constitutional government on the Kaiser. Here, this is Friedrich Wilhelm issuing his proclamation, promising, of course, that if they would stop attacking him, he would embrace a constitution. But as we read, hopefully you can see how Friedrich Wilhelm actually felt about this. So pause, read, and answer questions. And Friedrich Wilhelm is going to be able to mobilize the powerful Prussian army and push back against this, quote, crown from the gutter that he did not want. He refused constitutional government. He refused the crown of Germany if it came with any conditions of limiting his own power. The Frankfurt Parliament is going to be dissolved. The radicals in Berlin are going to be routed and driven out. And Germany is not going to become a thing. These revolutions are all going to be crushed. And then the Russians are going to sweep in to put an end to that whole Hungarian rebellion in Austria. Nicholas I, who we're not familiar with yet, but we'll learn about him when we start talking about Russia, is going to mobilize the massive Russian army, sweep in, and put down the rest of these revolutions. So, with that, the revolutions of 1848 come to an end. The only lasting impact of this, for the most part, is that France is now an empire, although an absolutist empire. And so for either the liberals or the radicals, more or less their goals have been crushed. And so we're going to start to see a movement not to seize control of governments immediately necessarily, but to start to mobilize the people themselves and to start to build propaganda in order to mobilize those people in order to push for change at the local level with the eventual goal of perhaps overthrowing some of these states. So those are the effects of the revolutions of 1848. Hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And when we come back, we'll start introducing guys like Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx, and Mikhail Bakunin, and start talking about the rise of socialism and communism. Thank you for listening.